Welcome to Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec podcast, with me, your host, Spec. This is a podcast where we talk through all of the pre-production that goes into making the theories that you see on the Lore by Spec channel and its associated channels. Let's get the shilling out of the way first. If you haven't gone and subscribed and liked and commented on the videos on Lore by Spec on the YouTube channel, please go ahead and do that now. That's one of the best ways that you can support me. This podcast is also available anywhere that you can find podcasts. So if you are listening, if you could like the podcast and maybe leave a little review, that does wonders for the algorithm on the podcast side, which really helps. And if you want to help support this podcast, this is the only one that currently doesn't use free tools. And since it's a paid thing, if you have the means to contribute to this, the link for this is in my description for my Ko-Fi. This helps me keep the light on and pay for all of the things that go into making this podcast a quality project. So we're finally getting around to this. This is the new teaser trailer that was launched for June. And this is going to be like a twofold podcast / reaction video. This is going to be uploaded as is, with not much thought going into production. This is just more to sit with you guys authentically and talk through some things. I haven't watched a lot of reactions to this because I didn't want it to skew my own view about it. But a couple of things to note. A, I'm sick. B, I'm not promising that this is going to be anything coherent. 3, there may not be a formal video up on this until next week because I'm meant to be going away for a little bit, take a bit of a break. So normal service will probably still resume for the podcast and normal videos, but I'm not exactly sure when this specifically is going to go up. I'm going to be breaking this down into probably 2 different watch throughs. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, take some time now to pull up the reaction trailer from the Kingdom Hearts YouTube or IGN or whatever. We're going to be watching this in 0.2 speed and then talking through the points bit by bit. So if you want to play along, that's what we'll do. For everybody else who's watching this video as I upload it, you won't need to do that because you will see what I'm talking about. So let's jump right into it. So it's very clear that the first person we see in this trailer has a slimmer build. The shoulders are quite pointed as per tradition for the organization's coach. However, the vibes are giving Larxene. I know that there were some people who saw this because this is happening on the same tower as the end shot of the first trailer with the Master of Masters making a hand, and that this person is looking down observing, which would lean more heavily towards this might be Invi, because her whole role as a foreteller was to observe. But it starts off by saying that the structure of this world is incredibly complex. So there's an acknowledgement here that there is something about the present registry as to where they are that makes things different from what we've or what they've previously been experiencing in terms of how words and worlds function. So once again, it's a shot of her watching, looking down at the rest of the world. At first, there were no manifestations of what we know of light and darkness. So we're in a present reality or unreality where light and darkness, in terms of their forms and of their powers, are not a thing. They're not as obvious. We need to be very specific about the wording that's being chosen here. There were no manifestations of what we know of light and darkness. So manifestations in this capacity means what we've previously seen or know to be heartless nobodies, etc. And what we know as light and darkness. So these previously established bodies of what is specifically in the light and what is specifically not. Like, are you one of the Keyblade of light wielders? Are you a heartless? Everything had a previous, very descript denomination. But what we know as light and darkness doesn't mean an absence of it. It simply means that there were no manifestations of it. So it never took its own form into being. Not that there was an absence of light and darkness in general. And I feel like that's something that potentially people might be skipping over in this, is that people might read this as in, oh, this is devoid of the previous, this is a utopia, this is a whatever, right? That's not what our person in the organization code is saying here. What they're saying is that there's no manifestations of it. It doesn't have its own form. Not that there is no such thing or there is no differentiation as to light and darkness. We get Shibuya Crossing. That's such a cool image of a Quadratum Darksider. The one thing I will say, though, is that when we look at it from here, 11 seconds in, if anybody wants to stop who's playing along, is that this does not look like a traditional Darksider. Even if you were to make it more our reality coded Final Fantasy-esque in terms of its visuals, there's not a lot in this design that screams a Darksider that we would have previously come to expect. And I know that this person goes on to say that, it wasn't until we arrived that these forms came with us, right? Since when does a Darksider have these strands that are tinted red? My instinct when looking at this is to think that this is akin to agony. This is something that is being fueled or funneled into this. This is darkness being pulled into this body, because it doesn't feel like it's radiating from, it feels like it's being pulled in, like it's being absorbed from the air and being then pulled into a form. That's not something that we would previously know or have any bearing from as to how Darksiders themselves get their forms. Like, it's certainly a video in and of itself looking into the role that Darksiders play in terms of Kingdom Hearts because they are a very consistent opening enemy in Kingdom Hearts, and that they also, in many ways, have a tie-in that isn't really ever properly explored here. But in all instances of the ones that we see, they tell a similar story. So if we think of Sora's, I can do this because I'm screen recording. Sora, Dark Cider, KH1. So we have this one, which was Kyrie's, and also the form that Sora fought in the opening of KH3. We have this traditional one that we've seen more commonly in Fragmentary Passage KH1. And then we have the Roxas version in KH2, which is the Twilight Thorn. But all of them, in their own ways, in their own respects, tell us something about what we're going into. KH1 was all about our first inferences with darkness, pure darknesses, etc. Twilight Thorn with Roxas fighting it makes sense because he was still in his pure nobody form. He wouldn't necessarily have a Darksider to face. KH3, as we all know, is fairly wobbly in its narrative. It makes a lot of sense that in the final world you're not fighting an actual Darksider, you're fighting something a bit more wibbly than that. When we think of Remind for Kyrie's Darksider, it was also made of water. And we have connections there between what we know of darkness and what we know of water. I'm beginning to think that someone in Swear seems to be a little bit aquaphobic, a little bit afraid of water. They're definitely not pro Subnautica, anyway. And I'm curious what it's trying to tell us here in its design, in the Darksider design. Because in many ways, the red tendrils is what's giving me my first indicator that something is amiss here, that this is being pulled in, something red, something angry. This seems to be not just fueled by light and darkness and it being as simple as that, but maybe something more nuanced of what's the culmination of an entity that embodies both darkness, everything the unversed represents, everything that Dream Eaters represents, everything that nightmares represent, even. And how does that manifest itself into a physical form when we don't have a vocabulary for that in a Final Fantasy-esque world, in our reality, per se? But the design itself is so cool, but there's a lot of this that's also giving not fully formed. It's giving this is a test for Sora and her other Keyblade wielders. This is giving, we'll see what you come up with while being presented with a very rudimentary test. But our arrival here brought those concepts with us. I've been chewing on the upcoming 2 sentences for hours because they're so interesting. how exactly can you bring something as nebulous as a concept to a place where it doesn't exist? We need to keep in mind, she literally just said there were no manifestations of what we know as light and darkness. So how on earth can you bring a concept of something to somewhere where it doesn't exist? And how can that take form in and of itself? It's an unreasonable, frankly, probably an impossible thing to do. Even for someone with master over domains to change the entire structure of a place. And if you knew that, our arrival here brought those concepts with us. Why would you not abandon those concepts if you knew that? If you knew that. So if we think of the upper echelon of, I wonder, can I drag a note in? Okay, cool. So we have the Master of Masters, then we have the OG foretellers, then we have the dandelion leaders, then we have whatever the missing link guilds were going to be, and then we have our basic ass keyblade builders. That's the hierarchy of events, right? Why on earth would you think that doing this was A, okay, B, that you would want to bring these concepts here to begin with? 3, if you knew the cause of doing that, why? A lot of these principles and the principles that we know, the stuff that has been beaten into us constantly in every single game, is this whole thing of you don't meddle in the affairs of other worlds. Exactly. Doesn't this mean the entire shattering of a world order? I'm going to say the words, and none of you are going to like what I'm about to say. Brain, before he left in the data version of Daybreak Town, described it as an infection, that he would be the infection that would break the fever. Y'all don't want to tell me that this doesn't look like an infection? That the foretellers are not the infection here? Because I got news. Got news for y'all. I fear our cohort and our protagonists are, in fact, the infection. The darkness given physical form only after we defined it. So those 2 statements can't be true. Those 3 statements can't be true at the same time. You can't say there were no manifestations of light and darkness before we got here. The darkness only came with us as a concept, and then it only took form after we defined it. those three to me are contradictory statements because it implies this notion of something being able to come from nothing and yet not at the same time. If something is a concept, it is something that is done in the head. It is done in another space that isn't a physical body. This person has already said that we have, in many regards, already sat down with the notion of there were no manifestations of light and darkness. But darkness was the only thing given physical form after they defined it. It could have been anything. But seemingly they're saying that they have the power to define what darkness looked like in this particular universe. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's possible. Because light and darkness have always had their own forms. Yes, I'm going to constantly be referring back to the previous games and what we do know and what we have, right? But think of Pure Blood Heartless versus Emblem Heartless. Think of anything that we do know that had a manifestation of it. Those were already forms that were defined in some ways, in many ways heavily defined, right? They had characteristics, they had attributes, they had elemental affiliations, they had structure, there were differences. A shadow is different from a neo. A dark side is different than one of the fuzzy angel ones that float around, which would be different again from an invincible. A behemoth is not a shadow. Those manifestations themselves already had prior form. They are no longer concepts at that stage. They simply can't be concepts at that stage. They have to have form because they're not an idea of something. They are something that exists. So to say that they are the ones who defined what darkness now presently looks like, I don't think they have the power to do that. I don't think they have the means to do that. It's unreasonable to think that they do have the means to do that. It's counterintuitive. It's unreasonable. And unreasonable is the word I want to use for this. It's quite hubristic to assume that they, from a concept, was able to define what darkness's physical form ends up being. That feels like such an undersimplification of what's actually happening here, which makes me think that our person narrating doesn't actually really know what's happening here and is simply just following along. And that's, while typical, I'd imagine, most of what I feel like I can talk about happens within these first 16 seconds because there's so much to dismantle from just those few sentences alone. Because I truly do not believe that it's possible after we defined it. Who is we in this regard? Does that just mean the OG foretellers? Does it mean including Mom? Who is we? And how much say did you actually all get in terms of, guiding the Master of Masters' hand in this? My argument is that you probably didn't. You probably didn't have a lot of this to begin with, because otherwise, why on earth would you agree to something like this. The thing that bothers me, I think, about the foretellers and the story of Union Cross, the way that they were telling it in terms of the foretellers specifically, is their blind fealty to the Master of Masters. Well, I don't know, maybe I'm more cynical, right? Maybe I'm just a bit more jaded and a bit more weathered, that I would not blindly follow people like that, especially when they're acting absolutely, in a way that does not make any sense. I would be questioning that. I would be regaling against that. There's no way that you could convince me as a foreteller, right, that let's go to a new universe where none of these concepts have any sort of existence, where even the thought of it having a physical form isn't even in the fabric of the universe that we're going to. And for all the things that we have passed down through history about not meddling in other worlds, not interfering, not doing anything that would upset the balance, that we're going to absolutely nuke a place. And their whole concept of their reality and internal DNA. There's no way you could convince me as a foreteller that this is a suitable expense, that this is a suitable price to pay for whatever the plot of this is meant to be, for whatever the plot of this is meant to do. Like, you can't convince me that this is the correct tactic. Anyway, it's such hubris to assume that they are the ones who decided that they were the ones who gave this form. Because you have to get the concept from somewhere. That poor Honda Civic is back at it again. It's interesting for this that we get to see such a violent act of Sora crashing through a window. We see our girl facing somebody in a coat. We never get any real indicator as to who or what she might be looking at, but from the dark blob we see on the left-hand side, we can assume it's somebody in a organization coat. Maybe we'll actually get the proper name of what that's meant to be and who actually makes the coats. She doesn't look like, in her expression, that she knows who she's talking to in this, which I think is interesting. Her expression's quite neutral. Right. So, the one thing I have seen is that everybody is saying that this is Sigurd because of the badge, the cape, and the emblems, right? And I'm not here to say that he's not, first and foremost, right? Okay? Everybody can have their own opinion about it. What we do need to be aware of, okay, is that Sigurd and co are a part of a brigade or a specific guard of people, and it's very clear that this is a uniform, right? This could be somebody in the similar faction to Sigurd. Let me see if I can grab Union Cross. So we see the same kind of very comparable emblems, right? But I'm pretty sure, yeah, so after reporting to an unspecified authority, this feels like this is more of an outfit than the person himself. Now, it could absolutely be that this is the man, the myth, the legend. But I'm more interested in the fact that this is very clearly an organization that has persisted through to Quadratum after millennia, easily millennia, right? Because we're thinking of the age of fairy tales here. So this organization, unspecified organization, has lasted until millennia later. Assassin's Creed could never, right? The Templars and the Assassins could never. So I'm more curious as to the faction denotion than the person himself. Our first glimpse at a new Keyblade, and I think everybody's missing it. It's so curious of an object. I can't really identify what it is at a glance. It looks quite akin to the same colouring as the Monsters Inc. ones in many ways. You've got a very stylized handle, and I wonder, can we go back far enough that we can see what the emblem is? And very specifically, so it's, what is that emblem? I've seen it before. I've certainly seen it before. Was it on the chess piece? Maybe. I've certainly seen this before. But my brain is not giving me the information. Also, doesn't he look like Corpse Husband? Corpse Husband, officially confirmed, KH4. He also looks like one of the upperclassmen from Union Cross, who I don't even think got a name. There are a couple of things I do want to point out, though, and is that he's very Yuzora coded. By that I mean the coat is very similar, with the same kind of buttons and details and patterns as Yuzora. But he's also giving me, and a lot of people are not going to like this, but when I first saw this and I saw the hair, I thought Vanitas. And I know so many people are going to be like, what? I don't see it. I mean, I can see it. We're just waiting for that mask to be gone, and you bet your bottom dollar that face is going to look very much like Sora's. We just map on different hair, and I'd put money on his face looking like Sora's. But his outfit's also very Vanitas coded. It's very Yuzora coded. And I'm curious what they're trying to tell us here. I'd also be curious, because this is the only bit of text we can see in Japanese, I'm assuming, possibly, maybe, what these specific characters are, because my bet would be that might point to some detail about this guy. And then we have Luxford, or to what I'd assume people will immediately jump to as Luxford, because, I mean, we've got the piercings, we've got the hair, the dress code is largely, it's very Final Fantasy 15 coded. It's very core. It's very core from Final Fantasy 15 coded. So, there's a few things about this specifically that I want to point out. That this does not feel like this happens in Quadratum, because there's too much greenery. And one of the first places we saw in the first trailer was this open kind of place that people thought was a nod to potentially a Star Wars bit. Potentially that was one of the foots of some of the mechs from. I'm not going to say a specific mech number because it'll invariably be wrong, and then I'll be dragged on the internet. And I don't feel like being dragged on the internet. I have too much of a sickie to want to do that, so I'm not gonna, and you're gonna have to deal with it. This is very clearly happening in a forest where there's a building, but there are black feathers that are falling. And my brain says Sephi. My brain says Sephiroth. Because we have seen those feathers fall before. And we also know that in KH2, when Cloud and Sephiroth clash after Sora defeats Sephiroth in 2, that they had gone off to somewhere unknown. That is what I'm pretty sure that is what they landed on. And I would imagine Mom needs allies. Sephiroth would be a pretty interesting play here with this battle of formation of ideas and darkness. What also might be interesting is that if I'm completely incorrect, right, we will get back to the next 2 scenes, is that if this isn't in Quadratum at all and this ends up being in that secret forest that Merlin and co. ended up sending Lee and Kyrie to, because this is, it's obviously hard to tell with just a still, right? But it is very leafy green in the same way. And how interesting would it be if our hubs where we thought things could exist in a vacuum are just as easily infiltrated by the things we don't want them to be? I just think that would be interesting. We have our boys in the underworld trying to deal with dear old Hades. I don't think there's a huge amount to discuss in this. I do think the boys are just going to be trying to work it out for at least the first part of 4, right? How wonderful of a throwback is this? So I know a lot of people are going to be like, I don't want Xehanort to be back in 4. However, as a few of my theories have pointed to, that this would not be the last that we have seen of Xehanort, and I was correct. Because this is Xehanort in his KH4 form, like I had kind of said. And isn't this a wonderful image if you consider back to the same image of Riku and Sora at the end of the Keyblade Graveyard? That the imagery is very similar, of being on his knees. What wonderful imagery. And what a nice teaser of Nomura's to actually put some artwork that actually ends up being a scene here. It does go to show that in this, there's a couple of things I find interesting about this. Is the callback to 3, that Xehanort in many ways seems to be taking Riku's protector slot, but that it's not all working, right? That umbrella is bent. That is not an umbrella that is managing to stay completely functional. It's dented a little bit at the sides. It's not holding its form. And I know that a lot of people will be like, why would that matter? Because it means that there is clearly a kink in whatever Xehanort's grand overall master plan has been to sort of thwart the foretellers or prepare Sora accordingly for this next chapter. That it hasn't all quite gone to plan, that there are some kinks, that maybe Sora hasn't fully developed the tools yet to stand on his own feet. And note that Xehanort isn't really keen in this scene to pick Sora up or reach out. In the corresponding scene in 3, Riku attempts to put his hand on Sora to console him. Xehanort has no such plans. He is letting Sora be where he is with no attempt to pick him up. He just has his hand in his pocket with the umbrella over him to be like, get up when you're ready, but nobody's going to do it for you. That's such a very different approach to what care looks like. So I'm going to be scooting a little bit because there are some things to do with this whole we will define what darkness looks like here. There are some patterns that we're noticing in the designs here that don't make me think that these are real Heartless. They seem more like they're being piloted. Like you don't look at this and go, this is an organic form. Even though it's very clear, right, that this is meant to represent some sort of solid rock type darkness. But glowing gauntlets do not give that vibe. In fact, even if we look at the new Neos, they don't give that vibe either. They're more human. You'll notice that even when that one went to go and chase Sora, it disappeared into smoke. But that these beings are gangly. They're atomically very human. They're very skeletal. So we've seen this before too, and I wish my brain would tell me from where. It might be Fragmentary Passage, but we have certainly seen this icon before. It's interesting that Sora is pulling out what is essentially the same attack as Ephemer in KH3. So once again, this is a very fibrous being. It's very 3D printed, right? It's not as organic or as fluid as a shape as we would anticipate it to be. This looks like data. It looks like wires. It looks like 3D printed. It looks like a mesh of negative feelings, negative emotions, not unique darkness in and of itself. And I think that that's really important to be able to sit with and acknowledge that when we're bashing at it, we're bashing the fibrous internal of it that's built up of red. It reminds me a lot of Five Nights at Freddy's depiction of Remnant and the stuff that gets abstracted from people in terms of their agony. I don't think there's anything else except that pops at that it will be multi at launch. It's interesting that the emblem per se of the organization still exists on the coats. But more specifically, I'm curious as to how deliberative of a decision that is. What I mean by that is, for me, like one of the biggest curiosities, I suppose, is that we don't know where these coats manage to manifest themselves from. We never really know where they come from. Like, somebody has to make them. They have to exist from somewhere. So, where? And I think that might be where we leave it for the first run of this. because I think that's all I've got in me for now. So prepare for more thoughts as I come up with them in due course. This has been Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec production with me, Spec. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me today. Just as a reminder, don't forget, if you haven't followed the Lore by Spec YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. It's free there. If you haven't taken the time to review the podcast or dropped a like and a comment, those really help too. And if you ever feel inclined to help me keep the lights on over here, head to Ko-Fi, which is in my description, to help support the podcast. Once again, thank you all so very much for listening, and I will see you all next time.